The triangular trade began in the 16th century. The journey began in Britain, where ships sailed across to Africa, and from Africa over to the Americas, and finally from the Americas back to Britain. This is where it gained its name, the triangular trade. On the first leg of the triangular journey, British sailors would sail their ships over to a number of African ports. The British took with them trading goods, such as guns, cloth and iron. They took these goods with them to trade with tribal chiefs who would give them captured African slaves in return. Once the British had traded with the tribal chiefs, they would take the captured slaves, and load the slaves onto their ships. This is where the second leg of the journey began. The British would take their ships full of slaves over to the Americas. This was called the Middle Passage. There were two ways in which the British would pack the slaves onto their ships. The first was called tight packing. This was where they would load as many slaves as they could onto the ships. On a tight-packed ship, it was likely that many slaves would not survive the journey. The second was called loose packing. This was when the British would put fewer slaves onto the ships, so that more of the slaves would survive the journey. The conditions on the ships during this journey were horrific. All slaves were chained together, restricting their movement. On board the ships, the slaves were not allowed to use the toilet, therefore the conditions they were living and sleeping in were filthy. This led to there being widespread disease on the ships, killing many of the slaves before they reached America. The slaves that died on the ship were thrown overboard into the sea. When the ships completed the Middle Passage, they landed in ports all over the Americas. Here, they would offload the slaves and sell them. In most cases, the healthiest slaves would be put up for auction where wealthy plantation owners would buy them. Once the slaves were bought, they would be forced to work on their owners' plantations where they would help produce trading goods. They often worked on tobacco, cotton and sugar plantations. This then led to the third stage of the journey. Ships would leave the Americas and travel back over to Britain, taking with them the goods which were produced on the plantations by the slaves. These goods would then be sold for money all over Britain. The slave trade between Britain and America continued for many years until the year 1807, when Britain finally made it illegal.